During my first year of college, a girlfriend of mine told me the story about how she lost her virginity to her college sweetheart. Oh my gosh, Sarah, it was perfect. He lit candles, we took a bath, there was rose petals, and it was just so good. This is the story we as young women are sold. We're told that when we choose to have sex, it'll be memorable and mutually pleasurable. But for many of us, women especially, that's not the case at all. It certainly wasn't my experience. The first time I decided to have sex, well, didn't feel like my decision at all. It was my first semester in college, and I was in love. He was a tall, muscular athlete. His abs, y'all. Woo! His abs. You could literally wash clothes on them. And for some reason, unknown to me at the time, he liked me. We began dating, eating at the dining halls together, walking together hand in hand across campus. Soon I began spending nights with him in his shared dorm room on his extra long twin mattress. I know, hot. I loved cuddling with him and the way that he made me feel. He made me feel safe and at home. Until one night, he woke me up by kissing my lips, so I kissed him back. As we progressed, he indicated he wanted to move forward, and I looked at him and whispered, "We can't. Your roommate's asleep right there." "Yes, we can, Sarah. I'll be quiet and quick, I promise." I know, romantic. As thrilling as it was to be desired like this, I was deeply uncomfortable. I had never had sex before, and he knew that. "But what if he wakes up?" I said. "That'll be so awkward." He persisted and persisted and persisted. And despite my quiet protests, he eventually looked me in the eyes, getting serious, and said, "You know how this works, don't you, Sarah? If we don't have sex and I don't finish, I'm going to be in so much pain. You don't want me to be in pain, right?" I didn't want him to be in pain. I loved him. So that night I submitted and laid there as my boyfriend had sex with my body. I was a silent, passive participant in my own sex life. As promised, he was quiet, and it was quick. And when it was done, I laid there wondering, what just happened? I felt cheap and used, disgusted with myself for not being more persistent in pushing him away and saying no. I thought, if I really didn't want this, wouldn't I have done more to protect myself? Sexual coercion is defined by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as unwanted sexual activity that occurs when someone is pressured, tricked, threatened, or forced in a non-physical way. Coercion is a form of sexual violence and is unfortunately rampant across universities, widespread within high schools, and found across intimate relationships after college as well. Despite millions of dollars spent across the United States today working to curb college sexual assault, sexual violence is still the most commonly committed crime on college campuses today, making up 43% of the total on-campus crimes each year. Now, as a Title IX coordinator for the past 7 years, working on college campuses to educate folks on sexual violence policies and curb sexual violence and eliminate gender inequities, what I have found is that many college educators and administrators are so comfortable talking about sexual violence. But when it comes to talking about the benefits of multiple orgasms, they're not going to touch it. This is a huge problem because they're both part of the same conversation, on sex and power and consent. Educational administrators are so comfortable speaking about sexual violence prevention policies, and we teach students and tell students to use enthusiastic consent, but fail to teach them on what to be enthusiastic about. What we need to do, and what the research will show, is that we need to spend less time talking about the threats of sexual assault and spend more time teaching students how to cultivate and create sex lives that are both consensual and pleasurable. Now, the great thing is, pleasure is found all across the research. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Institute of Health, and the World Health Organization all strongly recommend the use of comprehensive sexuality education, which, wait for it, includes pleasure. This type of education has been shown time and time again to reduce rates of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. During my second year of college, I learned about the power of pleasure. It was a university-sponsored pleasure party, and I decided to go. I walked into that room, and I was like, whoop, I'm gonna see my way right out of there. Sex toys were everywhere. There were big ones and small ones, curved and straight and pink and purple, and honestly, I was overwhelmed at the amount of options there were available. But this moment, it was absolutely revolutionary for me as a young adult, because for the first time in my 19 years of life, someone spoke to me about intimacy from a sex-positive perspective. Rather than focusing on how sex could harm me or traumatize me, she helped me understand that healthy sexual relationships can make you feel alive and beautiful, more connected to your body, and that if you develop the skills for healthy sexual communication, you could deepen your most intimate relationships. She presented sex as fun and funny, joyful, and beneficial to our overall emotional and physical well-being. And this perspective, which was so different, gave me the permission that I needed to even consider what it was that I wanted from my own sex life. She gave me the agency to begin to define for myself what a great consensual sex life looked like. And I carried this with me the rest of my life, because I realized for the first time ever that this was not something to give someone. This was an experience to be had together. And that was a perspective that had been missing for so long. I couldn't help but to think after that pleasure party back to my experience in my first year. If I had been taught and affirmed that my pleasure mattered, if my boyfriend had been taught to think beyond his pleasure, then maybe, just maybe, our first experience together would have gone much differently. We have the power to lower rates of sexual violence across our communities, but only if we are bold and brave enough to disrupt the system. I want each and every one of you to consider yourselves disruptors in your homes, in your schools, and in your communities. And as disruptors, here are 3 things that you can do to begin to integrate comprehensive pleasure-based education, sexual education, into your systems. Number 1, we must integrate credit-based comprehensive sexuality education into our educational systems so that any student, regardless of major, can elect to take a sexual education course to satisfy a general education requirement. Students must be incentivized to take this type of education. For colleges and universities, partnerships could be with orientation teams, first-year programs, first-year seminars, and residential living learning communities. Second, we must partner with student leaders. If I've learned anything from my 15 years working in student affairs and higher education, it is this. When students demand change in large numbers, administrators must listen. So I encourage you to tap into your fraternities, sororities, student groups, and athletics to build these new programs together and get the student buy-in. Number 3, when making this change to approach violence prevention from a pleasure-based perspective, you have to be bold and resolute in disrupting the system. Know that the research will support your efforts. Listen, I know from being that college administrator who talks about orgasms, what is at stake here. When I first started talking about the orgasm gap and its implications for power and sexual violence, a rumor immediately began that I was unfit for my role as a Title IX coordinator and that it was inappropriate for me to speak with college students about orgasms. Being that administrator that talks about orgasms, here's what I've learned. This is what's at stake. At a minimum, I could be discriminated against, fired, or seen as that weirdo that goes around campus talking about orgasms. But on the other hand, as an administrator who has sat with and supported hundreds of sexual assault survivors, I know what happens if we do not make a change and disrupt the system. We will continue to perpetuate a system of negligence that harms our students and causes lifetimes of trauma. Change can occur. With 1 in 5 women identifying as a victim and survivor of sexual violence after attending college, change must occur. And that change begins with you. Each and every one of you sitting in this audience or listening to this talk has the power to disrupt the system and lower rates of sexual violence. But only if you are bold and brave, if you believe in the power of pleasure, if you use the research and find the change makers on your campuses who are willing to try something new. Talking with students about sexual violence policies is just not enough. It's not working, and it's the approach that most colleges and universities take today. What we need to do is go beyond that, and we must start incorporating deep conversations about pleasure. Thank you.